Anna sat at the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the peeling paint on the walls of her tiny apartment. Sunlight, faint and weak, filtered through the worn-out curtains, casting shadows on the scuffed floor. The place smelled of dampness and dust, a constant reminder of how far life had dragged her down. She hugged her knees to her chest as she glanced at the eviction notice crumpled on the floor, a paper that carried words she could no longer ignore. She had 2 days, just 2 days, before she would lose even this. It felt like she had spent her entire life in a losing battle with circumstances, always hoping for a miracle that never arrived. Her hands were calloused, evidence of years spent working jobs that paid little and demanded much. She thought about her last shift at the diner, where she'd spilled coffee on a rude customer's lap and lost her temper after his insults. That final straw had cost her the only steady income she had. Her boss had reluctantly let her go, offering pitying eyes but no hope. Now the job was gone. Her savings were non-existent, and her fridge was empty except for a carton of expired milk. She forced herself to her feet, slipping on her worn-out shoes, their soles fraying from years of wear. Outside, the noise of the city buzzed around her. People rushed past, their lives seemingly full of purpose while hers stood still. She moved through the streets with a determined stride, clutching a small stack of resumes she had printed with her last few coins. The papers were slightly bent now, tucked under her arm as if they might shield her from the day's growing uncertainty. Anna entered shop after shop, trying her best to smile as she handed over her resume. Each rejection landed like a new weight in her chest. "We're not hiring right now. We'll call if something comes up. Sorry, but we need someone with experience." The words blurred together as the hours stretched on. By noon, her optimism had faded completely, replaced by exhaustion and the gnawing ache of hunger in her stomach. She sat on a bench in a small park, her fingers fumbling through her bag for something, anything to eat. All she found were crumbs and an old mitt. She sighed, leaning back and watching children play on the swings, their laughter carefree and distant from the world she knew. Her mind drifted to the past, to when she was one of those children. Back then, her world was filled with colors. She used to sketch for hours, on paper, on walls, on anything she could find. Art had been her refuge, her passion, her dream. People said she had talent, and for a while, she believed them. But dreams didn't feed empty stomachs or keep roofs over heads. Her parents had died young, and life had quickly taught her that survival came first. Art was a luxury for people who didn't need to choose between rent and food. She hadn't picked up a paintbrush in years. Anna's phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from her landlord, a curt reminder of the time left to vacate. Her fingers tightened around the phone as frustration bubbled up in her chest. She wanted to scream, to cry, to ask the universe why it had chosen her for such a cruel hand. Instead, she swallowed her tears and stood. The afternoon turned into evening as Anna walked aimlessly through the city. Her legs ached, and her feet were blistered, but she didn't stop. There was no point in going home to an apartment she would soon lose. A drizzle began, light at first, but the rain grew heavier as she made her way down streets she didn't recognize. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, its thin fabric no match for the cold, damp wind. Passing by a shop window, she caught her reflection, a woman with tired eyes, tangled hair, and shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She turned away, ashamed of what she saw, and kept walking. She thought about the people who used to care about her, friends who had drifted away over the years as her struggles grew heavier. It wasn't their fault. Nobody wanted to be pulled into a sinking ship. Her pride had kept her from asking for help when things had started to spiral, and now it felt too late. As night fell, Anna finally found herself back in front of her building, shivering and soaked through. She paused before stepping inside, her breath misting in the cold air. She stared at the dark, narrow stairwell that led up to her room and wondered how much longer she could keep fighting. How much more strength did she have left? She climbed the stairs, pausing on each landing to catch her breath. By the time she reached her door, her hands trembled as she unlocked it. Inside, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. The light bulb flickered above her, casting dim light across the barren room. She sank onto the bed, too tired to remove her wet coat. The eviction notice sat where she had left it, as though taunting her with the reality of what was to come. Anna picked it up and read it again, though she already knew every word. She let it drop back to the floor and lay down, staring at the cracked ceiling. The rain outside tapped rhythmically against the window, the sound strangely soothing despite everything. In the quiet darkness, Anna whispered to herself, "It'll be okay." But even as the words left her lips, they felt hollow. How could it be okay when there was nothing left to hold on to? Sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake for hours, her mind racing with thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. She had no plan, no answers, and no hope. Only the lingering fear that life was running out of chances. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Nicholas sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, staring absently out the window as the city passed by in a blur of lights and motion. The hum of traffic outside, mixed with the distant murmur of the news radio, his driver liked to keep on. To anyone else, he looked the part. A man in his early 30s, tailored suit, impeccable shoes, an air of confidence wrapped around him like armor. But to Nicholas, the polished reflection in the window felt like someone else's ghost. The day had been long. Endless meetings, phone calls, and decisions that carried millions of dollars worth of weight. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow, as he often did. Success had come to him quickly, yet it felt fragile, as though it could vanish if he stopped moving. So he didn't stop. He worked harder, lived faster, always chasing something unnamed. Tonight was no different, just another day where the emptiness followed him home. The car slowed as they approached a busy intersection. Nicholas glanced up, eyes scanning the crowd on the sidewalk without much thought. And then he saw her. At first, he wasn't even sure what had caught his attention. A fleeting glimpse of someone moving against the flow of pedestrians. A woman, her shoulders slightly hunched, clutching a coat that seemed too thin for the weather. She looked out of place, tired and alone in a way that struck him harder than it should have. It was her face. Something about it tugged at the back of his mind like a half-formed memory. "Stop here," Nicholas said suddenly, startling the driver. "Sir, just stop the car." The car eased to a halt at the curb, and Nicholas stepped out without explanation. The chill hit him immediately, but he barely noticed. His gaze locked onto the woman as she turned the corner ahead, disappearing into the crowd. He quickened his pace, weaving between people, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the city noise. When he caught sight of her again, he froze mid-step. She had stopped in front of a bakery window, peering inside at the golden pastries on display. Her hand lingered on her stomach, almost absent-mindedly, as though hunger was a constant companion she had grown used to. And suddenly it hit him, the bridge, the cold night, her voice. Years ago, as a lost, angry teenage boy, Nicholas had stood on the edge of a rusted bridge with nothing left to hold him back. He had stared into the black water below, his mind filled with a quiet, dreadful certainty that the world would not miss him. Then this girl, had appeared. She didn't scream or try to grab him. She didn't treat him like a freak or a burden. She simply stopped, looked him in the eye, and said softly, "You matter more than you think." It had been enough. Just enough to make him step back and reconsider. Enough to plant a seed of doubt in his pain. She didn't know it then, and perhaps she didn't even remember it now. But that moment had saved his life. Her kindness had given him something to hold on to, a thread that eventually led him away from the darkness and toward the man he had become. And here she was, years later, the woman who had unknowingly given him everything, standing alone and staring at pastries she couldn't afford. Nicholas felt something shift inside him, a mix of shock, gratitude, and a quiet, aching guilt. How long had she been struggling like this? Where had her life taken her? How was it that fate had brought her back into his world now, when he had everything, and she seemed to have nothing? Before he could think, he stepped forward, but she turned abruptly and began walking again. Nicholas hesitated, watching as she disappeared down the street. Approaching her now, stopping her to say what felt impossible. How could he explain all of it? That he remembered her? That she had saved him when no one else could? He returned to the car, his thoughts a whirlwind. "Everything all right, sir?" the driver asked as Nicholas climbed back in, visibly shaken. Nicholas didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the street where she had vanished, his mind replaying the image of her face, the way her shoulders slumped as she walked away. "Find out who she is," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Her name, where she lives, everything." The driver blinked in confusion. "Pardon me, sir?" Nicholas turned to him, his expression set in stone now. "I want to know everything about her." As the car pulled away from the curb, Nicholas leaned back against the seat, his mind still reeling. The years had changed him, turned him into a man the boy on that bridge wouldn't have recognized. He had money, power, and influence now, things he used to think would make him invincible. Yet seeing her had unearthed a truth he couldn't ignore. He owed her more than he could ever repay, and the thought of walking away, of letting her suffer while he lived this life she had helped make possible, was unbearable. For the first time in years, Nicholas felt a purpose beyond profit or power. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to help her. This wasn't about pity or charity. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. All he knew was that the woman who had once saved his life needed saving now, and he wouldn't let her down. Nicholas sat in his office, staring at the file spread open before him. A small stack of papers, her name, her address, a few scattered details of her life, lay in front of him, but it wasn't just data on a page. Every line in that file painted a picture of Anna's struggle. Unemployed, evicted, no close family or friends to lean on. His heart sank as he read her history, a history of quiet resilience in a world that had given her little in return. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling under the surface. How had the universe been so unfair to her? She had saved his life once, and now life had turned its back on her. Nicholas wasn't the sentimental type. Years of corporate life had hardened him against unnecessary emotion. But this was different. This was personal. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His assistant, Jared, stepped in. "Sir, the meeting's starting soon." Nicholas glanced at his watch. "Reschedule it." Jared hesitated. "Sir?" I said reschedule. Nicholas's voice was firm but distracted. He was already forming a plan, his mind racing through possibilities. Offering her money felt crude. He knew her type. Pride would never allow her to accept charity. No, he had to create a solution she couldn't refuse, one that wouldn't make her feel small or pitted. An idea struck him, and he reached for the phone. Within an hour, he had the details in place. A small, seemingly innocuous offer. One that, if handled right, could change everything. Anna sat on the edge of a splintered park bench, a brown paper bag clutched tightly in her lap. A simple sandwich and water bottle had been bought with her last few dollars, and she picked at the bread absently, her mind elsewhere. The weight of her eviction loomed over her like a dark cloud. She needed a plan, but planning seemed impossible when every option led to a dead end. She didn't notice the figure approaching until she heard her name. "Anna." She looked up sharply, her eyes widening in surprise. A man stood a few feet away, his tailored black coat and sharp shoes standing out against the grimy backdrop of the park. His face was familiar somehow, though she couldn't quite place him. "Yes," she said cautiously, her fingers gripping the bag tighter. The man stepped closer, offering a disarming smile. "I hope you don't think I'm being intrusive. My name is Nicholas Hart." He paused as though waiting for recognition, but she only frowned. "I own Hart Enterprises. We may have crossed paths briefly the other day." She blinked, struggling to recall. She vaguely remembered bumping into someone on the street earlier in the week. But why would a man like this be here? "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Nicholas hesitated before speaking again, his tone soft but measured. "I have a business opportunity one think you might be interested in." Anna stiffened. Business opportunity? Her instinct was to laugh bitterly. People didn't offer opportunities to women like her. Women who couldn't keep a roof over their heads, let alone hold down a steady job. She stood up abruptly, clutching her bag. "If this is some kind of scam, I'm not interested." "It's not," Nicholas said quickly, his voice calm. "Hear me out, please." Something in his tone, earnest and steady, made her pause. She glanced around the park, as if someone might appear to explain what was happening, but there was no one. She sat back down warily, keeping her eyes on him. Nicholas sat on the bench beside her, careful to give her space. "I'm in need of a new personal assistant," he began, as though discussing the weather. "It's an immediate position. Competitive pay, flexible hours, and why me?" Anna interrupted, her voice sharp and suspicious. "Do I look like someone qualified to be a personal assistant?" Nicholas met her gaze steadily. "I don't hire people based solely on qualifications. I hire them for their grit and determination. I've done my homework, Anna. You're not afraid of hard work, and you don't give up easily." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know me?" "I'd like to," Nicholas replied gently. "I'm not offering a handout. This is a job, one that will pay you well enough to get back on your feet. I'll even provide temporary accommodations until you're stable. In return, I get someone who's willing to work hard and adapt." Anna studied him, her expression wary. Every instinct told her to say no. It was too good to be true, and in her experience, when something felt this way, it usually was. But another part of her, tired, desperate, and holding on to hope by the thinnest thread, couldn't dismiss him entirely. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. Nicholas hesitated. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable, like the polished mask he wore had cracked just enough to let something real shine through. "Sometimes people deserve a second chance. That's all I'll say for now." The two of them sat in silence, the sounds of the city filling the empty spaces between them. Finally, Anna exhaled a long breath. "I'll think about it." Nicholas nodded, seeming to understand her hesitation. "Fair enough. Here." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a business card. "Call this number when you're ready. I'll have everything arranged." Anna took the card reluctantly, staring at the embossed lettering as though it might vanish in her hands. When she looked up again, Nicholas was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the crowd. For a long moment, she sat frozen on the bench, her mind whirling with doubt and questions. It was absurd, really. A man like that had no reason to help someone like her. And yet, his offer felt real, so real it scared her. Anna tucked the card into her coat pocket and whispered to herself, "Don't get your hopes up." But deep down, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years stirred her chest. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? Anna's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the elevator button, watching the numbers blink above her. She clutched her tote bag to her chest, feeling like an imposter. The polished floors of Hart Enterprises gleamed under the bright lights, the distant hum of conversations and ringing phones seeping through the pristine glass doors. This was a world she had no business entering. Yet here she was, wearing the nicest second-hand blouse she could find and shoes she'd scrubbed until the worn leather almost shone. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped out into the hushed, imposing hallway of the top floor. An older man at the front desk greeted her with a polite smile, but Anna couldn't miss the quick flick of his eyes, taking in her cheap clothes and unsure posture. "You must be Anna," he said smoothly. "Mr. Hart is expecting you. Right this way." She followed him, heart pounding in her ears, every instinct telling her to turn around and bolt. But she forced herself to keep walking. This job, this ridiculous, unbelievable offer, was her last shot. Pride wouldn't keep the lights on or put food in her stomach. Nicholas stood when she entered the sprawling office. The view behind him, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, made the entire city look small. Anna swallowed hard. He looked like he belonged there, his suit sharp and immaculate, his expression calm. He didn't seem like a man who should know people like her. "Anna," he said warmly, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "I'm glad you're here." She sat down stiffly, her tote bag now clutched in her lap. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she blurted, her voice sharper than she'd meant. "I'm just saying that up front." Nicholas didn't miss a beat. "I disagree. I think you're exactly the right person." Anna frowned, caught off guard by how easily he dismissed her protest. "You don't know me?" "Not yet," Nicholas admitted. "But I know enough to trust you." and trust is the most valuable thing in my office." The confidence in his voice disarmed her, but she didn't argue further. The man was strange, offering opportunities to people who hadn't earned them, but she was too desperate to keep questioning his motives. The first few days were overwhelming. Nicholas had handed her a thick binder labeled "Welcome to Hart Enterprises," filled with protocols, phone lists, and words she'd never seen before. He assigned her simple tasks, organizing schedules, typing emails, and answering calls. Even those things made her feel like a fish out of water. She fumbled more than once, accidentally disconnecting a call or sending an email with the wrong subject line. Each mistake sank her stomach further, her confidence unraveling. But Nicholas never scolded her. Instead, he would appear quietly at her desk, crouch down to her level, and patiently explain what went wrong. "You're learning," he would say, his tone always calm. "That's what matters." At first, it annoyed her. Who was he to be so understanding? She expected him to give up on her, to see her for the failure she believed she was, but he never did. Slowly, her walls began to crack. One evening, Nicholas stopped by her desk just as she was gathering her things. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Anna looked at him warily. "I'm not fired, am I?" He chuckled softly, a sound so rare that it made her blink in surprise. "Not even close." He gestured for her to follow him. "Come with me." He led her to a small, quiet room off the main office space. Sunlight poured in through the windows, illuminating a table covered in fresh art supplies. Charcoal pencils, paints, brushes, and canvas. Anna froze in the doorway, her breath catching. "What is this?" "You told me once, in passing, that you like to draw," Nicholas said softly, standing beside her. "It's been a rough start, and I thought you could use a space to yourself." Anna's throat felt tight. She couldn't bring herself to step into the room, to touch the beautiful, clean supplies waiting for her. "I haven't drawn in years," she whispered. "Then start now," Nicholas replied simply. "No one's watching. It doesn't have to be perfect." The way he said it, gentle, unassuming, broke something in her. Her fingers brushed the handle of a paintbrush, and her chest ached with a longing she hadn't felt in years. She didn't paint that day, but something inside her stirred awake. Over the next few weeks, trust began to form between them. Nicholas was still distant, in some ways reserved, as though he carried secrets he didn't want to share, but he treated her with a quiet respect that unsettled her. He pushed her when she doubted herself, and he listened without judgment when she admitted her fears. Once, when they worked late, Anna found herself opening up over takeout containers at his desk. "I used to want to be an artist," she admitted, staring at her half-empty carton of noodles. "But I gave up on that a long time ago." "Why?" Nicholas asked, his voice genuinely curious. "Life doesn't care about dreams," she said with a bitter laugh. "You can't eat a sketchbook." Nicholas didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. "Life doesn't make it easy, no," he said finally. "But dreams matter more than we think. Even the small ones." His words lingered with her long after she left the office. On quiet evenings, when she was alone, Anna began to use the art supplies he'd given her. At first, it was just pencil sketches, simple shapes on blank paper, rough and imperfect. But as the days went by, the sketches turned into something more. Colors began to emerge, tentative strokes of paint that grew bolder with each attempt. And when Nicholas passed by her small studio room one afternoon and saw her bent over a half-finished canvas, he didn't say a word. He only smiled faintly and kept walking, as though he had expected nothing less. For the first time in years, Anna felt like she was waking up, piece by piece, brushstroke by brushstroke, becoming someone she had almost forgotten how to be. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the days at Hart Enterprises had settled into a rhythm for Anna. Her mornings were now spent answering calls, managing schedules, and coordinating details that Nicholas trusted her to handle. It still surprised her how quickly she had adapted to a world she had once felt unworthy of. Every day, she entered the gleaming building with her head held a little higher, and when Nicholas offered her those occasional small smiles, it gave her the strangest sense of purpose. She mattered here, and that was something she hadn't felt in years. But even as things began to change for her, there were moments when the stillness of it all felt too easy, too perfect. She had a warm place to sleep now. Nicholas had arranged for a modest but comfortable apartment, assuring her that it was part of her compensation package. Her fridge was stocked, and for the first time in years, she wasn't constantly chasing the next meal. She had even begun to paint again, spending late evenings lost in color and canvas. It should have been enough. It was enough, yet a small, gnawing doubt had taken root in the back of her mind. Why had Nicholas offered her this job? Why her? Out of all the people he could have chosen, she wasn't anyone special. She had no connections, no impressive qualifications. It didn't make sense, and the more she tried to ignore it, the louder the questions became. Then came the whispers. It was subtle at first. She caught the way Jared, Nicholas's assistant, glanced at her sometimes with thinly veiled curiosity. When she brought papers to another executive assistant, she overheard quiet murmurs behind her back. Is that her? The one he's helping? The words stuck to her skin like burrs, small and cutting. She tried to brush them off, telling herself she was imagining things, but the uneasy feeling refused to leave her. One evening, Anna stayed late to finish organizing a particularly overwhelming set of reports. The office was quiet, most of the staff having already left for the night. The hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic sound of her typing filled the silence, a strange comfort in the otherwise empty space. That's when she heard it. Two voices, low but distinct, floated from down the hall. One of them she recognized as Jared's. The other was unfamiliar. I still don't get it, the stranger said, a mix of skepticism and curiosity. What's Hart's deal with her? He's never been this involved with anyone. It's about something personal, Jared replied, his tone hushed but unmistakable. Apparently, he feels like he owes her, like a huge debt. You know how he gets when he's fixated on something? Anna froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She strained to hear more, her pulse thudding in her ears. What kind of debt? The stranger pressed. Jared sighed. No clue. All I know is he's been watching out for her, paying for things, setting her up with this job. He's practically rebuilding her life for her. Don't know why, but it's not just business. It's personal. Anna couldn't listen any longer. Her hands were shaking as she saved the report and closed her laptop, the whispers still ringing in her head. She grabbed her bag and hurried out of the office, her mind spinning. Debt? Rebuilding my life? As she stepped into the night, the cool air hit her face, but it didn't calm her. Nicholas had been kind, generous even, but this made it sound as though she were a charity case, someone to be fixed. The thought made her stomach turn. What did he owe me? The next day, Anna's mood was unreadable. She avoided Nicholas as much as possible, keeping her exchanges brief and professional. But her silence didn't go unnoticed. Late in the afternoon, Nicholas appeared at her desk. Anna, he said gently, his brow furrowed with concern. Can I see you in my office for a moment? She didn't meet his eyes as she followed him inside, her heart pounding. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. What's going on? He asked softly, his tone careful. You've been distant all day. Anna's hands clenched at her sides as she finally looked at him, anger and hurt bubbling beneath the surface. I heard something last night. Something about how you owe me. How you what? Rebuilding my life. Nicholas froze, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, but she saw the guilt flash in his eyes. He opened his mouth as though to respond, but she pushed forward, her voice rising. Is that what this is, Nicholas? Pity? Charity? Some kind of debt you think you need to pay off? No, he said quickly, standing up. It's not like that. Then what is it? She demanded. Because this job, this apartment, the supplies, it all feels like you're doing this out of guilt, like you're trying to fix me. Nicholas ran a hand down his face, a rare crack in his calm demeanor. It's not guilt, he said softly. It's gratitude. The word hit her like a punch. Gratitude? Nicholas exhaled, looking at her with an intensity she'd never seen before. I've wanted to tell you, Anna. I just didn't know how. He paused, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Years ago, when I was young and lost, you saved my life. You didn't know it at the time, but you did. You told me I mattered when no one else did. That moment, it changed everything for me. Anna stared at him, stunned, her breath catching in her throat. The office seemed to tilt slightly, the air thick and heavy. "What are you talking about?" Nicholas took a small step closer. "I was on the edge of a bridge that night. You stopped. You looked at me, and you told me I mattered. That's why I'm here. That's why you're here." Silence stretched between them, so loud it roared in her ears. Her mind reeled, struggling to process his words. She searched his face, hoping to find some sign that this was a lie, but all she saw was raw honesty. "I owe you everything," Nicholas said quietly. "This isn't about fixing you, Anna. It's about giving back what you gave me." Anna staggered back a step, feeling like the ground beneath her had disappeared. Everything she thought she knew had shifted. She turned toward the door, unable to speak, needing to escape before the weight of it crushed her. And Nicholas, for the first time, let her go. Anna didn't remember how she got back to her apartment. Her legs had carried her on autopilot, her mind replaying Nicholas's words like a broken record. "You saved my life. I owe you everything." She sank onto the edge of her bed, staring at her shaking hands as if they weren't her own. It didn't make sense. None of it did. She tried to recall that moment on the bridge he'd described, but her memories felt blurry, like staring at a faded photograph. How could something so small, a few words to a stranger, have changed someone's life so completely? How could it have led to all of this? A job, an apartment, art supplies, everything Nicholas had done for her. It was too much, too big, a debt she didn't remember creating. The thought made her stomach twist. Gratitude, he'd called it, but it felt like a burden. How was she supposed to live with that weight? How could she ever look him in the eye again, knowing he had been carrying her kindness for years, while she couldn't even remember it? Sleep was impossible. The night passed in fragments, her staring at the ceiling, pacing the apartment, standing by the window, and watching the city lights blink in the darkness. By morning, her reflection in the mirror looked as disheveled as she felt. Hollow eyes, a face that had lost its color. When Nicholas's number flashed on her phone screen just after 9 a.m., her thumb hovered over the button, but she let it ring out. Twice more that morning, his calls went unanswered. Finally, a text appeared. "Please, let me explain. Come to the office when you're ready." The words sat on the screen, staring back at her, offering an olive branch she didn't know if she wanted to take. She shoved her phone in her bag and left the apartment. The walls felt too small. The sound of Nicholas's office door clicking shut behind her was too loud. Anna stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her posture rigid and defensive. Nicholas was already on his feet, his usual calm rattled in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night too, but there was something else in his face too. Relief. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "I almost didn't," Anna replied, her voice flat. "I'm not sure why I did." Nicholas motioned to the chair across from his desk, but she shook her head. "I'll stand," she said sharply. He sighed, leaning against the edge of his desk. "You're angry." "I'm confused," Anna corrected, her voice trembling. "And frustrated. And, honestly, I feel like a joke." Nicholas flinched slightly. "You're not a joke, Anna." "Then explain it to me," she snapped, her voice louder now. "Because from where I'm standing, this is ridiculous. I saved your life? I don't even remember that. I don't know how I'm supposed to deserve any of this." "You don't have to deserve it," Nicholas said quietly. "That's not how this works." "Then why?" Anna asked, her throat tightening. "Why are you doing this? Why me?" Nicholas looked at her, the steel in his usually unshakable expression softening into something vulnerable. "Because you mattered to me before I mattered to anyone," he said. "You don't remember it because it was probably just a passing moment to you. But to me, it was everything. You were the first person to see me when I felt invisible." Anna's chest ached, her anger deflating as his words hit her. Nicholas took a step closer, his voice calm but raw with honesty. "I was 17, alone, angry at the world and ready to give up on it. I stood on that bridge and I don't think I even knew what I was waiting for, some sign maybe. And then you appeared." He paused, his voice wavering for just a moment. "You didn't yell or panic. You didn't look at me like I was broken. You just looked at me, really looked at me, and said I mattered. And for some reason, I believed you." Anna felt tears sting her eyes, her throat tightening. I don't understand, she whispered. Nicholas continued, his words slow and deliberate. That moment pulled me back. It didn't fix everything. I was still a mess, but it gave me something I didn't know I needed: hope. It's what pushed me to fight, to work, to become someone I thought I never could be. And through all of it, I never forgot you. Not your face, not your words. I told myself that if I ever had the chance to help you, if I could give back even a fraction of what you gave me, I would. Anna's arms dropped to her sides, the weight of everything settling into her bones. But I didn't do anything, she whispered. You did, Nicholas said gently. Kindness isn't measured in grand gestures, Anna. Sometimes it's a single moment that changes everything. You gave me that moment. You saved me. Even if you don't remember. The tears she'd been holding back slipped free, silent and unstoppable. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to find something to say, but words wouldn't come. Nicholas didn't move closer, didn't try to comfort her. He let her process it, standing there quietly like he understood exactly how heavy this was for her. Finally, Anna took a shaky breath. I don't know what to do with this, she admitted. It's too much. I don't know how to. You don't have to do anything, Nicholas interrupted softly. You don't owe me anything, Anna. This isn't about repaying a debt. This is about choice. I chose to help you because I wanted to, not because I had to. That's it. Anna looked at him, the raw sincerity in his words settling something inside her. She still didn't fully understand it, still couldn't reconcile how a moment she barely remembered could carry such weight, but there was no lie in his eyes. No pity, no condescension, just gratitude. And for the first time, Anna let herself believe it. She mattered. Even when the world had made her feel invisible, she had mattered to someone. I need time, she whispered, her voice small. Nicholas nodded, his expression soft. Take all the time you need. Anna turned and walked toward the door, her heart heavy but for the first time in a long while, not empty. Anna walked slowly back to her apartment, the city's noise folding around her like a dull hum. Her steps were steady, but her mind raced. Nicholas's words still echoed in her ears. Kindness isn't measured in grand gestures. Sometimes it's a single moment that changes everything. The weight of it made her chest tight. She had spent so much of her life believing she didn't matter, that her struggles were insignificant. And yet, her existence, her words had saved someone like Nicholas. The man who stood at the top of the world, with his wealth, his influence, his polished confidence, had been nothing more than a broken boy on the edge of a bridge. And she, Anna, forgotten and invisible in her own life, had unknowingly given him the hope to keep going. How could that be possible? How could she reconcile the two images of herself? The powerless woman she saw every day and the person Nicholas spoke of. Back in her small apartment, she sank onto the worn couch, her body slumped with exhaustion. She sat there for hours, staring blankly at the wall. Memories she'd buried long ago started to rise, one by one, like faded photographs. She remembered her teenage years, long, empty days spent alone after her parents died. She had learned how to survive in silence, how to carry herself as if she were unbreakable when everything inside her was shattered. The night on the bridge came back to her in a hazy flash. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She'd been walking home, cutting through the park, lost in her own problems. Then she'd seen him, a boy, barely more than a silhouette, standing dangerously close to the edge. She hadn't hesitated. She didn't know why. Maybe because she knew what it felt like to be on the brink of giving up. She had spoken to him softly, instinctively, with the kind of care no one had shown her in years. You matter more than you think. Her own words, spoken without thought, had come back to her. At the time, she hadn't even stayed long. She'd assumed he would brush her off, the way people usually did. But now she realized that moment, her small, impulsive choice to reach out, had become the foundation of something far greater. And still, she struggled to accept it. Her mind wandered to the last few weeks. Nicholas had given her so much, opportunities she hadn't dared to dream of again. The job, the apartment, the art supplies. It had felt like charity at first, like pity, and she'd resented him for it. But now she saw it differently. Nicholas hadn't been trying to save her out of guilt. He'd been giving her the same thing she had once unknowingly given him, a chance to believe in herself again. Her gaze drifted to the small table where her half-finished canvas sat, brushes scattered beside it. The painting was rough, raw, a burst of color and emotion she hadn't thought herself capable of. She walked over and traced her fingers along the edge of the canvas. Her art had been dormant for years, buried under the rubble of survival. Now, it was beginning to surface again, hesitant but alive. She picked up a brush, dipping it into a soft swirl of blue paint. The stroke of color across the canvas felt like a release, a quiet exhale that carried something heavier away. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't think about the outcome. She didn't wonder if her work would be good enough or if it mattered to anyone. She painted for herself, for the part of her that had been silenced and ignored for far too long. Hours passed. The light outside faded, and the hum of the city grew quieter as night fell. Anna's apartment was warm now, filled with the faint scent of paint and something else, possibility. The finished canvas sat before her, full of vibrant colors and gentle edges. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had created something that didn't exist before, and that alone felt like enough. Over the following days, Anna carried herself differently. She went to work with a quiet determination, no longer shrinking from her tasks or doubting her abilities. She held her head higher when she walked through the doors of Hart Enterprises, no longer feeling like she didn't belong. Nicholas noticed, though he didn't say anything. He let her grow at her own pace, observing from a respectful distance. Anna also began to spend her evenings painting, filling the empty canvases Nicholas had provided her. Each brushstroke seemed to pull something free inside her, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding in for years. Her apartment slowly transformed. Bare walls were now lined with her art, bold and alive. She didn't hide them anymore. She let them exist, just as she let herself exist. One afternoon, while organizing Nicholas's schedule, she paused to look at the man sitting across from her desk. He was studying something on his laptop, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration. She realized then how much Nicholas had given her, not in money or resources, but in something far more valuable, belief. For so long, Anna had been invisible to the world, but Nicholas had seen her. Not just the struggling woman she had become, but the person she could still be. He hadn't demanded anything from her. He hadn't expected her to repay a debt she hadn't even known existed. He'd simply given her the space to find herself again. That night, as she stared at a new blank canvas, Anna thought about everything that had led her here. The struggles, the hopeless nights, the bridge she had crossed both literally and figuratively. And for the first time, she didn't feel weighed down by the past. Instead, she saw it for what it was, a path she'd survived. When she picked up her brush, her hands steady and sure, she realized something important. Nicholas had given her a second chance, yes, but she was the one who had taken it. She had chosen to keep going. She had chosen to grow. And that, she thought, made all the difference. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back, the small art gallery buzzed with quiet conversations and the shuffling of footsteps as people admired the work on display. Soft yellow lights bathed the room in warmth, making the splashes of color on the walls come alive. Anna stood frozen near the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't even meant to come at first, but here she was, standing in the doorway of a moment she wasn't sure she deserved. Her hands trembled as she clutched the program card, her name printed neatly in the corner. Anna Caldwell, listed as one of the featured artists. It still didn't feel real. For so long, her art had existed only in private, in the quiet spaces where no one could judge it. Now it hung on the walls of a gallery, bold and unafraid, staring back at her with its raw honesty. People lingered in front of her paintings, murmuring softly as they tilted their heads to take in the brushstrokes. Some even smiled. A few leaned in closer, pointing out details she hadn't thought anyone would notice. Seeing strangers react to her work was like standing on a ledge, both exhilarating and terrifying. "You belong here," she whispered to herself, as if saying it aloud might make it true. The event had been sponsored anonymously, and it didn't need 3 guesses to know who was responsible. Nicholas's fingerprints were all over it. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, since that day in his office when he'd told her the truth. She had needed time to process, to grow, to find her footing again without feeling like she was living under someone else's shadow. But tonight, as she stood surrounded by her work, she realized what Nicholas had given her wasn't a crutch. It was a chance to stand tall on her own. He had never tried to own her success, never demanded gratitude. He had simply opened a door and let her walk through it herself. A soft laugh drew her attention to one of her pieces, a canvas filled with delicate shades of blue and gold, painted to resemble the quiet stillness of a sunrise. A man in a worn coat stood in front of it, explaining its beauty to a little girl holding his hand. "It's like hope," the man said, his voice soft but clear. "It starts out small, but it fills everything." The girl nodded, her eyes wide. "It's my favorite one." Anna pressed a hand to her chest, her throat tight. That was what she had painted, hope. She hadn't known how to name it before, but hearing it from a stranger made something click inside her. Her art mattered. She mattered. The door creaked open behind her, and the subtle shift in energy pulled her attention. She turned her head slowly, almost afraid to look. But there he was, Nicholas. He stood near the entrance, dressed in a dark coat over his suit, looking both entirely out of place and perfectly at home. His gaze scanned the room quickly before landing on her. Their eyes locked, and everything else, the voices, the footsteps, the hum of life, seemed to fall away. For a moment, neither of them moved. Nicholas's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or relief. Anna's heart stumbled in her chest, and she turned away, suddenly unsure of what to do with herself. Nicholas didn't hesitate. He made his way toward her, his steps calm and unhurried, until he stood a few feet away. "Anna," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She turned to face him, clutching the program tighter. "You came. I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied. His gaze drifted to the paintings on the wall, and the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "They're beautiful. You're incredible." Anna felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's not perfect," she said quickly, looking away. "Neither was I," Nicholas said gently. "And yet, you saw something worth saving." Her breath caught, her eyes snapping back to his. Nicholas wasn't smiling anymore, but his face was open in a way she rarely saw. There was no facade, no mask, just him, honest and raw. "I don't know what to say to you," she admitted quietly. "I've spent weeks trying to figure it out, but I still don't know." "You don't have to say anything." Nicholas's voice was steady. "This," he gestured around the room, "this says everything." Anna swallowed hard. She felt the weight of everything she'd been through. All the doubts she'd carried slowly begin to lift. "I used to think I was invisible," she said softly, "that the world wouldn't notice if I disappeared. I guess I was wrong." "You were," Nicholas agreed. "You've always mattered, Anna. You just needed to see it for yourself." For a moment, they stood in silence. Anna's chest felt light, as though a knot she hadn't even realized was there had finally come undone. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice breaking just a little. "For everything. Not just the job, or the art supplies, or this." She waved vaguely at the gallery. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't." Nicholas's expression softened. "Thank you for doing the same all those years ago." Anna looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see the millionaire or the powerful businessman. She saw Nicholas, the boy on the bridge, the man who had carried her words with him for years, and the friend who had given her the space to heal. "Would you like to stay?" she asked finally, her lips curving into a small smile. Nicholas's eyes lit up. "I'd like that." He stepped back, letting her lead the way as she moved toward the crowd, where strangers admired her work. Anna walked with her shoulders back and her head high, no longer afraid of being seen. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not because Nicholas had brought her here, but because she had brought herself. And as she stood next to him, surrounded by the warmth of people seeing her art, Anna realized that this, right here, was the second chance she had always hoped for. The sun filtered softly through the windows of Anna's apartment, warming the small space she had made her own. Canvases leaned against the walls, some half-finished, others vibrant and alive. Paintbrushes sat in jars, their bristles stained with colors that told stories. The apartment no longer felt empty. It hummed with life, with dreams reborn. Anna stood in the center of the room, her eyes falling on one of her newer paintings. A woman standing on a bridge under a gray sky, her face turned upward toward a break in the clouds. It wasn't subtle, but it was honest, and that's all she wanted her art to be. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Anna set down her cup of tea, wiping her hands on her paint-splattered jeans before opening the door. Nicholas stood there, his sharp suit offset by the relaxed smile on his face, as though he'd been waiting for this very moment. "Morning," he said, holding out a small bag. "I brought breakfast. Figured you might forget to eat when you're working." Anna arched an eyebrow, but couldn't hide her smile. "I do not forget to eat." He tilted his head, smirking as he glanced around her apartment. "The empty takeout boxes on your counter disagree." She laughed softly, stepping aside to let him in. Nicholas set the bag on her small kitchen table, pulling out croissants and coffee. The room was quiet as they sat together, sharing bites of flaky pastry while the world outside moved on without them. "How's the gallery been since the showcase?" Nicholas asked, breaking the silence. "Better than I expected," Anna replied, leaning back in her chair. "A couple of my pieces sold. The gallery owner said she wants to keep a few on rotation for the next exhibit." She paused, her voice softening. "It still feels strange. People liking what I make." Nicholas shook his head. "It's not strange. It's deserved. You've worked for this?" Anna studied him for a moment. The faint creases at the corners of his eyes, the way his posture was more relaxed now than it had ever been when she first met him. "You know," she began slowly, "it wasn't just me who changed." Nicholas glanced up, a flicker of curiosity in his expression. "When I first started working for you," she continued, "you were distant. Like you were always carrying something too heavy for anyone to see. I didn't realize how much until you told me about the bridge." Nicholas's gaze softened, the mask he wore in his professional world slipping away. "I think I spent so many years running from that part of myself that I forgot it was still there," he admitted quietly. "You reminded me that it's okay to stop running." Anna nodded, understanding more than she could say. She had spent years doing the same, running, surviving, shrinking herself until she felt like nothing at all. Yet somehow, in this strange collision of their lives, they had both found pieces of themselves they'd lost along the way. "You don't owe me anything, you know," she said after a pause, her voice steady. "I know." Nicholas smiled faintly. "And you don't owe me anything, either." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words settling comfortably between them. There had been so much guilt on both sides, so much unnecessary pressure to repay kindness that had never asked to be repaid. But now, there was something lighter, an understanding, a balance. Nicholas glanced at one of the paintings on the wall, a bright abstract piece that pulsed with shades of gold and blue. "What's next for you?" he asked. Anna followed his gaze, her lips curving into a thoughtful smile. "I don't know exactly. I'm just taking it as it comes. Painting, saving up. Maybe one day, I'll open my own studio. Teach kids who feel invisible, like I used to." Nicholas's eyes warmed at that. "I think you'd be perfect for that." "And you?" Anna asked, turning the question back to him. "What's next for Nicholas Hart?" Nicholas leaned back, his smile easy and unguarded in a way she was still getting used to seeing. "For the first time in years, I'm not thinking about what's next. I'm just enjoying what's now." Anna let his words linger, feeling their quiet truth. She had spent so much of her life thinking about the next step, the next hurdle, the next impossible task. But now, here in this moment, she didn't feel rushed or anxious. She felt present, alive. As Nicholas stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to her. "There's a new exhibit opening downtown next week," he said casually. "If you're free, I thought we could go together. As friends." Anna looked at him for a long moment, something in her chest softening. "As friends?" she repeated playfully. Nicholas smirked. "For now." Her smile widened, and she nodded. "I'll think about it." When he left, the apartment felt quieter, but not empty. Anna stood in front of her latest canvas, staring at the streaks of color she'd laid down earlier that morning. The painting wasn't finished yet, but she wasn't in a rush to complete it. She picked up her brush and began to work, each stroke deliberate, every detail filled with intention. Her life was no longer something she had to survive. It was something she was creating day by day, piece by piece, just like her art. Nicholas had opened the door, but she was the one who had walked through it, who had chosen to believe in herself again. And for that, she was proud. As the afternoon light poured through the window, Anna smiled to herself. There was no bridge ahead of her now, no edge to fall from, only open ground, endless and full of possibility. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of where the road might lead. Because this was her beginning, a real beginning, and it was hers alone to paint. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.